Chapter 4. The Western Campaign. When Attila turned his eyes to Rome, Honoria's letter and the most expensive proposal in history. In 450 A.D., a Roman princess named Honoria made what is possibly the most catastrophically bad decision in the history of romantic desperation. She sent Attila her signet ring and asked him to rescue her from an arranged marriage. Justa Grata Honoria was the sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, and she was furious, caught in an affair with her estate manager, who was promptly executed. She had been sentenced to an unwanted betrothal to a safe, boring senator. In a moment of either genius or total madness, she got a message to Attila, along with her ring and what amounted to a request for help. Attila, whose diplomatic imagination was as creative as his military one, interpreted this as a marriage proposal, claimed Honoria as his bride-to-be, and demanded half of the Western Empire as her dowry. Valentinian's response was predictably frantic. Honoria was condemned, pardoned, condemned again, and eventually married off to her boring senator. Attila's demands were refused, and so, in 451 A.D., Attila assembled the largest army he had ever commanded. Roman sources give numbers ranging from 200,000 to 700,000, with modern historians estimating somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000, and crossed the Rhine. The Western Campaign had begun. The invasion of Gaul, fire from the east. The speed and scale of the Hunnic advance through Gaul was staggering. City after city fell or was abandoned. Metz was sacked and burned on April 7th, 451, a date still remembered in local Frankish tradition. Reims, Strasbourg, Cologne, Amiens, Beauvais. The list of attacked or destroyed cities reads like a tour of modern France. The population fled west and south in massive waves, carrying what they could and leaving everything else behind. Contemporary accounts describe the roads choked with refugees, the rivers running with ash, and a sky perpetually orange on the eastern horizon. But Attila made a critical error, or perhaps a calculated pause at Orleans. The city held out long enough for relief to arrive in the form of an extraordinary coalition. Aetius, the greatest Roman general of his era, had assembled an alliance that included not just Roman troops, but Visigoths, Burgundians, Franks, Alans, and a dozen other Germanic peoples. The man known as the last Roman Aetius had actually grown up as a hostage among the Huns and understood their tactics better than any Roman alive, was marching to meet Attila with an army that was, for once, nearly a match for the Hunnic force. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, the day the world held its breath. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains in June 451 A.D. is one of those historical engagements where the stakes were so enormous that even the ancient sources seem to strain under the weight of what they're describing. The exact location is disputed somewhere in the Champagne region of modern France, but the broad outlines of the battle are reasonably clear. It was massive, it was brutal, and it lasted most of a day. Attila placed his own Huns at the center, with his Germanic vassals on the flanks. Aetius placed his most reliable Germanic allies, the Visigoths, under their king Theodoric, on his own right flank, the strongest position. The fighting was so intense that the Visigothic king Theodoric was killed in the melee, trampled by his own cavalry in the chaos, according to some sources. Attila's center drove deep into the Roman lines. Aetius's flanks bent inward, and then somehow it ended without a decisive result. The Huns retreated to their camp, which they fortified with a circle of wagons. Attila, according to Jordanes, prepared a funeral pyre of horse saddles so he could throw himself onto it rather than be captured alive. The Romans and Visigoths, exhausted and grieving their dead king, failed to press the attack. By morning, Attila began his withdrawal back toward the Rhine. He had not been defeated. He had fought the greatest coalition Rome could assemble to a standstill and walked away. But he had also not won. For the first time, someone had said no to Attila and survived. Chapter 5. The Italian Campaign, God's Scourge at the Gates of Rome, across the Alps. If Attila had been stopped, or at least slowed in Gaul, he was not deterred. In 452 A.D., he gathered his forces again and crossed the Alps into Italy. His first major target was Aquileia, one of the most important cities in northern Italy, a major commercial hub, military base, and gateway to the Italian peninsula. Aquileia was heavily fortified and fiercely defended. It held out for months. Attila, by ancient accounts, was about to abandon the siege when he noticed a flock of storks carrying their chicks away from the city walls and interpreted this in the way that a man of his era would, as an omen. The city was falling. He pressed the attack. Aquileia fell and was destroyed so completely that it never fully recovered. Its refugees, fleeing into the Adriatic lagoons, are traditionally credited with founding what would eventually become Venice. From Aquileia, Attila swept south and west. Padua, Vicenza, Verona, Brescia, Bergamo, Milan, city after city, either fell to his forces or bought their survival with enormous payments. The Western Emperor Valentinian had fled from his capital at Ravenna, eventually retreating all the way to Rome. The Roman army, having suffered the attrition of the Gallic campaign and dealing with supply shortages along the devastated northern routes, was not in a position to offer a serious defense in the field. Italy lay open, Leo and the Mincio. The meeting that saved Rome. What actually happened when Pope Leo rode out to meet Attila at the Mincio River in 452 A.D. is one of history's great unsolved mysteries, and the explanations offered across the centuries say as much about the people offering them as about the event itself. The contemporary Christian interpretation was straightforward. Leo spoke, God intervened, and Attila was miraculously turned back. A later tradition even added the apparition of Saints Peter and Paul appearing behind Leo with drawn swords, which was helpful, if not necessarily verifiable. Medieval artists depicted the scene obsessively, most famously Raphael in his Vatican fresco Leo in his pontifical robes, serene and commanding, while Attila's horse rears in terror at the divine vision above. The secular explanations are more prosaic but not necessarily wrong. Attila's army was suffering from plague and supply shortages. By the time of the Mincio meeting Italy in summer, stripped of its food supplies by the campaign itself, was not feeding his troops. The Eastern Emperor Marcian, who had replaced the weak Theodosius II, had used the opportunity of Attila's western campaign to stop paying tribute and launch attacks on Hunnic territory across the Danube. Attila may have calculated that pressing on to Rome, with a sick army, dwindling supplies, and a threat developing in his rear, was a gamble not worth taking. Probably both explanations contain truth. Leo's embassy, the spiritual authority of the Bishop of Rome, delivered with whatever personal charisma and diplomatic skill Leo possessed, gave Attila a face-saving reason to do what military and logistical realities were already recommending. He could withdraw not as a man who had been turned back by plague and supply problems, but as a man who had listened to God's representative, the scourge of God, responding to God's servant. There is a kind of dark grandeur to the narrative that Attila himself might have appreciated. Chapter 6. The death of Attila, the anticlimax that changed everything. The wedding night. Attila, the Hun, the man who had terrorized 2 Roman empires, who had slaughtered tens of thousands, who had burned cities from the Rhine to the Po, died in bed on his wedding night from a nosebleed. In the spring of 453 A.D., Attila took another wife, a young woman named Ildiko, described by our sources as beautiful. The wedding feast was, by all accounts, spectacular, conducted in the grand theatrical style of the Hunnic court. Attila ate and drank with characteristic excess, the celebration going on deep into the night. The next morning, when his attendants came to wake him and he didn't emerge, they eventually forced the door to his bedchamber. They found Ildiko crouching in the corner, weeping in terror behind her veil, and Attila was dead, lying in his own blood, a fatal hemorrhage having burst through his nose and throat during the night. He had drowned in his own blood while his new bride sat helpless beside him. The death was almost comically anticlimactic for a man of such mythological stature. No battlefield, no assassination, no divine intervention, just too much wine, a burst blood vessel, and the final indignity of being found dead by your servants in your own bedroom. Ancient and medieval writers immediately suspected foul play. Ildiko was the obvious suspect. Attila had murdered his way to power, accumulated enemies beyond counting, and his new wife was from a Germanic tribe he had previously conquered. The paradox of Attila's legacy. Here is the great paradox of Attila the Hun. He almost certainly could have destroyed the Western Roman Empire. He had the military power. He had the will. In 452, with Italy prostrate before him, Rome was his for the taking. He didn't take it. Whether because of Leo's intervention, military practicality, or strategic calculation, he turned back, and by doing so, he allowed the Western Empire to stumble on for another generation, long enough for the mythology of Roman continuity to pass to the Church, to the Germanic kingdoms, to the Eastern Empire. Long enough, in other words, for Rome to become something more durable than a political entity, an idea. The irony is that by not destroying Rome, Attila may have done more to shape the future of Western civilization than if he had. The Christian Church, which produced the narrative of Leo's miraculous triumph over the scourge of God, emerged from the 5th century with its authority immeasurably enhanced. The Bishop of Rome had done what no emperor or general could. He had stopped Attila. The papacy's claim to spiritual authority over temporal power, a claim that would define European politics for the next 1,000 years, was, in a very real sense, secured on the banks of the Mincio River in 452 A.D. Attila is also remembered, strangely, as a founder rather than just a destroyer. The refugees fleeing his Italian campaign, as mentioned, are credited with founding Venice. Various Hungarian traditions claim him as a proto-national hero, a bridge between the steppe world and the European world that Hungary occupies geographically and culturally. Turkish peoples have also claimed him as an ancestor, connecting the Huns to later Turkic migrations. Whether any of these genealogical claims are historically accurate is debatable. What they reflect is the enduring power of Attila's image as the ultimate representation of the steppe world's challenge to sedentary civilization. Chapter 8. Attila in History and Myth. The legend that refused to die from history to mythology. Within a generation of his death, Attila had already begun the transformation from historical figure to mythological one. In the Norse sagas, particularly the Volsunga saga and the Atlakvida, he appears as Atli, the king who murders his brothers-in-law Gunnar and Hakni for their gold, and who is killed by his wife Gudrun in revenge. The story bears only the loosest resemblance to any historical events, but it captures something real, the sense of Attila as a figure of overwhelming, dangerous, ultimately self-destructive power. In the German epic tradition, culminating in the Nibelungenlied, written around 1200 A.D., he appears as Etzel, a powerful but ultimately passive king, whose court becomes the setting for the catastrophic final act of the Nibelung saga. Here, the characterization has softened considerably. Etzel is noble, generous, and somewhat bewildered by the carnage unfolding around him. The memory of historical Attila has been filtered through 5 centuries of Germanic storytelling into something almost sympathetic. In later European tradition, Attila became the ultimate metaphor for unstoppable destructive force. Attila and the Huns became bywords for barbarism that European writers reached for whenever they wanted to describe an existential threat. During World War I, British propaganda routinely referred to the Germans as the Huns, invoking Attila as the archetype of the civilizational enemy. The association was historically dubious. The Germans of 1914 were not particularly related to the Huns of 450, but the rhetorical power of the reference was self-evident. Attila had become not just a historical figure, but a symbol, the name you reach for when you want to say, this is something that threatens everything we've built. The rehabilitation of Attila. In recent decades, historians have pushed back hard against the one-dimensional barbarian destroyer image of Attila. The scholarship of the last half-century has reconstructed a far more complex picture, a politically sophisticated ruler who used military force as one instrument of a broader strategy, who maintained a functioning multicultural court, who understood Roman politics often better than the Romans did, and who showed remarkable restraint on multiple occasions when total destruction was within his reach. The Attila who emerges from modern historiography is genuinely impressive, not despite the ancient sources, but in dialogue with them. Yes, he destroyed cities and killed tens of thousands of people. Yes, his methods were brutal, even by the standards of an era not short on brutality. But he also negotiated, compromised, restrained himself, maintained alliances, and demonstrated a strategic intelligence that repeatedly confounded a civilization with 5 centuries of imperial experience. He was not a mindless force of nature. He was a man, a remarkable, terrifying, occasionally merciful, ultimately human man, who found himself at the intersection of 2 worlds and shaped both of them in ways that still echo today. Final thoughts. The scourge who made the world. Here is what I want you to take away from the story of Attila the Hun. He is remembered as a destroyer, and he was. The cities he burned stayed burned. The people he killed stayed dead. The terror he spread across a continent was real, and its consequences lasted for generations. None of that is mythology. The bones on the banks of the Nisus River were real bones. The refugees who built Venice on the lagoons were real refugees. But destruction is rarely the whole story of anyone who shapes history. Attila the Hun, the man who made 2 Roman emperors beg, who turned a pope into a hero, who drove refugees into lagoons where they built one of the most beautiful cities in the world, was also, paradoxically, one of the architects of the medieval Europe that rose from Rome's ashes, the papacy's authority, the Germanic kingdoms, the memory of Rome as idea rather than institution. All of these were, in part, his work, even if he never intended it. The ancient world had a phrase for people like Attila, flagellum Dei, the scourge of God. The idea was that God used such figures as instruments of punishment to chastise a civilization grown corrupt and complacent. Whether you believe in that kind of divine intervention or not, there is something to the metaphor. The Roman Empire of the 5th century was corrupt and complacent. It had stopped being able to defend itself, stopped being able to govern justly, stopped being able to inspire loyalty in its own people. Attila didn't cause Rome's fall. He revealed it, and then he died in bed, on his wedding night, from a nosebleed. History, as always, reserves its strangest punchlines for its most terrifying characters. Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, the nightmare of two empires, the man whose name became a synonym for unstoppable destruction, was undone not by a Roman army, not by a Gothic sword, not by the hand of God, just by his own body, quietly given out after 50 years of hard living, while a frightened young woman sat in the corner and didn't know what to do. He was human, after all. The most terrifying thing about him was always that.